There are some places that look really good. One of the things to remember about globalization is it created this artificial security environment that encouraged a lot of countries that had not been able to be significant industrial powers before to suddenly join the game. Germany and Korea are probably the poster children for the success of globalization. But if we go back to something a little bit more basic, where trade is more localized, where you have to have a decent security system that you can maintain yourself, or you have a neighbor that does it for you, break the world up. And if you look at a map of like 1910, you probably are going to get a pretty good idea of who the countries are that can actually do reasonably well. So I think Southeast Asia is probably the region overall that's primed to grow the most, because here you have an area that does not have a history of going to war with itself, not like Northeast Asia or Europe. Most of the resources that they need, they produce themselves, or those resources come from Australia. Most of these, or this region as a unit, can produce most of the food that it needs, and what it can't can come from Australia and New Zealand. And most of these countries have a reasonably positive relationship with the United States, both strategically and economically. So while I don't think the United States is going to be facing a war with the Chinese, I don't think they're that dumb, I can see some sort of mini globalized system that takes place in Southeast Asia, with the Americans being at least an adjunct part. Taiwan, assuming that, again, that there's no war, is probably kind of join the system with Singapore as kind of the high-tech anchors for that sort of system. That's something that could work really well. I also think Mexico is in a pretty good spot. Now, the cartels are a problem. The drugs are a problem. That is not going away anytime soon. That is going to define the successes and the failures of the Mexican state and Mexican culture for decades to come. And that's an ugly story. But Mexico has done something that most countries can only dream of. They've cut an economic long-term partnership with Donald Trump. And if you have that already done, then it's just an issue of building out the infrastructure and the industrial plant. And Mexico knows how to do that. So the NAFTA 2 Accords, because they were done by the anti-trade hard right in the United States, are really secure no matter what happens with the American political model moving forward. And then kind of the final, we mentioned France earlier. I think France is going to be okay. And then the final country that I normally would have not considered that I need to add in now is Japan. Because Japan, like Mexico, got a deal with Donald Trump and has since gotten a deal with Joe Biden, making Japan the only country that has cut a long-term economic and security partnership with both sides of the American political aisle. They found a way to buy themselves into America's inner circle. And they're the only ones who have done that. It is old and it is aging quickly. Three things they have going for them. Number one, even though they have no resources, they now, courtesy of the U.S., have access to the entire Eastern Hemisphere. That makes a big difference. Number two, as their population has aged into obsolescence, they have moved more and more of their industrial plant abroad, most notably to the United States and Mexico. So they no longer have as much of a labor crunch as a place like Germany does. They don't have to make the transition nearly as hard. And then third, and what people miss, is that Japan has been very successful at figuring out how to get by with fewer people while also boosting their birth rate. Japan today has a higher birth rate than Italy, Germany, China, South Korea, or Taiwan. So they're still old, they're still aging, but the process has slowed down a lot in the last 25 years. So every concern you have is legitimate and is for the long haul, but they've found a way to buy themselves some more time. Well, considering the nature of their financial sector, I'm not sure it ever was. I mean, and that's the part of the problem for my work is, like, I can tell you if a country is going to experience national success, but that does not mean that they're a good investment destination. Their population has actually probably been bigger than China for 7 or 8 years.
Okay, yeah.
Remember, the Chinese numbers today do not yet reflect that overcounting.
I know. Planned economy, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I think India's future is pretty bright. They're the first stop out of the Persian Gulf, so they won't have a meaningful energy crisis. They're one of the few countries that could actually intervene in the Persian Gulf if they wanted to. I'm not saying that they're itching to, but it's an option, which in the world we're going to is good to have options. Their tech sector is small for the size of their economy, but growing and pretty robust and pretty inexpensive. And they have more than enough energy processing to make sure that they're not going to face the sort of shocks in terms of supply for either manufacturing or agriculture that a lot of the rest of the world will. That's where the good news kind of ends. Their demographic structure is obviously far better than Europe or East Asia's, but it's not as good as it used to be. They started urbanizing very seriously in the early 1990s and have been aging as a result. So actually Mexico has a significantly healthier demographic structure now. But more importantly, the infrastructure and the political infrastructure in India is poor, and it's difficult to integrate among the cities and among the regions. So as we lose Chinese manufacturing, countries around the world are going to pick up pieces of that to service their own markets. India is part of that story, but India will never rely on other countries politically, and honestly, it can't economically, for participating in a multi-country supply chain systems like we're familiar with in Europe and in North America. India will produce things for Indians. And when you're producing things for 1.5 billion people, that is a global story. But India will not be trading with hardly anyone as part of that story. I think Brazil has had its moment. Brazil's infrastructure is really difficult because it's built basically on imagine Brazil as a table, but two of the legs have been knocked out. Unfortunately, the high end is on the coast. So the cities on the edge can access the interior, but it's very hard for them to get to the water. And that's why Sao Paulo is the biggest one, because it's on top of the plateau and it has a little bit more room to expand. That makes it very difficult for Brazil to integrate with anyone, even Argentina. They were able in the 80s and 90s to develop a series of technologies and some manufacturing capacity that was fairly impressive. But then the Chinese came in under the first Lula government and set up a bunch of joint ventures and basically raped the Brazilians of all of the technology, and then went back home and stole all of Brazilians' market share in global trade and destroyed the entire manufacturing base. So that story is over. So Brazil is still a commodities producer, and that's about it. They have a demographic structure that's similar to India, so good, but not as good as Mexico. But the capital cost of developing stuff in Brazil is just higher than the global average. And whenever there's a competing source that opens up, it's able to undercut the Brazilians on price. That's probably most obvious in oil. Yes, they've got the pre-salt. Yes, by the numbers, Brazil probably can become an exporter to the tune of 3 or 4 million barrels a day. But you're talking about a cost of production in those zones. It's at least $80 to $90 a barrel, and that's some of the highest in the world. Obviously, the U.S. is the top of my list, and not just because I have citizenship. A couple other things that are kind of color that. The United States has the highest security of any country. The average citizen has higher security than any other time in history without the artificial imposition of things like the global order. And we're probably going to have to double the size of the industrial plant over the course of this next decade simply to produce the things that we used to get from imports. And if you think of the last time that the United States had a growth spurt like that, and the last time the Germans were dealing with security and economic dislocations, 1 million Germans came to the United States in the 1840s and changed our political culture forever. I expect another mass move of much larger scale this time, and not just from Germany. So, it's hard to go wrong here. Obviously, the United States has other issues that you have to deal with. Me personally, because I'm a little atypical, I went to university in New Zealand, so I couldn't qualify for citizenship there anytime I want to. It's not that New Zealand is self-sufficient when it comes to things like food and energy. It is part of an internationalized supply chain system that it needs. But it's an extended part of the American family, and it's an extended part of the Southeast Asian network as well. So it is heavily exposed to both of the two big growth poles of the future. And in addition, if we get into a situation where the Kiwis have major security problems, the rest of us are long gone already.